Konnichiwa, street dogs. Watashi wa Eric Kim desu. So this is the turbo thought of the day, or one of many turbo thoughts. Why I find notions of, chromatism or chroma, or essentially referring people by the skin pigment, quite problematic. So, I am very anti notions of calling people white, colored, black, yellow, red, orange, purple, pink, green, and this is why. So this is where thinking about language is really important, because inherent in these words are essentially racist ideas. What up, Liz?
Hi, how are you?
You get your swell on?
Trying.
Get the gains.
Always.
I like your face mask. So for example, if you call somebody colored or black or yellow or whatever, red, you're essentially it's inherent into the language means other, foreign, strange, barbaric, cannot be trusted, dangerous, whatever. And if you study etymology, I'm a big fan of Wiktionary.org. If you study the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, the word Niger, N-I-G-E-R, is similar to the word night, and essentially, the Romans and the Greeks, right? They're kind of like more olive oil skin toned. Like if you've seen a modern day Greek person or an Italian person, that's like what they essentially looked like. And let us assume that ancient Athens or ancient Greece was the apex of culture and civilization. They essentially looked like what the typical American might think is Middle Eastern. So, certainly there's a lot of genetic and racial diversity in Greece, but for the most part, people had a certain skin tone or a Pantone that was kind of more like darker olive oil, brownish, right? And because they're in the Mediterranean, they're closer to the equator, and technically when we think about white people, we tend to talk about like Northern Europeans, right? So people from Sweden, Norway, essentially the higher north you go, to the North Pole, people have lighter skin pigment because, for example, I was in Umeå, spelled U-M-E-A, Umeå, or Umeå, Sweden. Dude, in the wintertime, I kid you not, there's literally only 30 minutes of sunshine a day. So consider, if you want to maximize your vitamin D's, your body is not going to produce a lot of melanin or the skin pigment tone in order for you to absorb the maximum amount of sunlight, right? However, if you're closer to the equator where it's sunny as hell, right? Then your body's gonna produce more melanin in order to offset the oversaturation of vitamin D's or sunlight. So even for myself, I'm Korean. I'm technically East Asian. My skin pigment is the thing that's interesting about Korea, right? We got 4 distinct seasons, and so I think Koreans tend to be a little bit more on the fairer side, which means during the winter time when there's no sunlight, our skin goes pretty pale in order to absorb more sunlight, whereas in the summertime it gets pretty freaking hot. So even for myself, you might not noticed, I've been kind of getting my tan on, and I'm just walking around the sun a lot. So even when I used to play tennis in high school, my skin tone fluctuates hugely depending on whether it's winter or summer. And this is actually why I'm happier when I'm in the East Coast, because the East Coast weather is actually more similar to Korean weather, where there's 4 distinct seasons. So, you know, in Korea it snows, East Coast it snows too. So, like, as I honestly think that California is very overrated, and this is coming from a native-born Californian who was born in the Bay Area and lived most of his adult life there. I think the East Coast in terms of weather is far superior. The dynamic range of weather is better, and if you want to be happier, I would actually say move to the East Coast. I'm actually very happy here in Providence, Rhode Island. I think it's the best city in America, maybe even the world. But anyways, let me continue my spiel. So when you call somebody white, you're essentially inherent in the language means chosen, worthy, pure, superior, great. And taking it back to the ancient Romans and the Greeks, right? Essentially, you know, you could only measure other people according to your own standard. So, like, let us consider if the ancient, you know, Greeks or Romans, whatever, they're kind of this Mediterranean, like kind of olive oil, you know, kind of like brownish color. Anyone who's significantly darker than them is a foreigner. And, you know, even when they dealt with the Ethiopians way back in the day, they looked at the Ethiopians with suspicion because the skin pigment is different, right? And so, for example, you know, I think it's human nature that you look at anybody who kind of doesn't look like you with suspicion. And, you know, this is kind of a stupid bias too, but if I meet somebody else who is like Asian or East Asian or Korean, like either consciously or subconsciously, I kind of have a greater predilection to them, that like I favor them a little bit more because they kind of look like me. Now this is totally unfair, but I think it's just the human bias, and at least I know that I'm personally aware of it. But anyways, so if we keep using these terms like colored, white, black, you know, yellow, red, whatever, it's hugely problematic because we're going to continue to propagate racism and morphologyism and colorism and classism and, you know, chromatism, and which is kind of our unintended side consequence. So for example, let's imagine America 500 years from now, and I'm quite certain America will still, let's say 300 years from now. I mean, America's been around roughly around 300 years, and according to Nassim Taleb's Lindy effector rule, high likelihood America will be at least around for another 300 years. I'm not sure if America will be around 2,000 years from now, but I can say with a high certainty America will be around 300 years from now. So let us imagine America 300 years from now. You look at the Bay Area, you look at the East Coast, whatever. Essentially everyone is mixed race now, right? Like, you know, it's quite common that you see Caucasian dudes marry East Asian women, right? Pretty common trend I see, which means you think they're kids, right? Let's say, you know, I'm Caucasian, I'm part Irish, I'm part German, I'm part Polish, Russian, Swedish, from Amsterdam, Dutch, whatever I may be. And let's say my wife is like Japanese or Korean or Chinese or South Asian, like Indian or whatever. My kids, are they gonna be white, colored, or something else? And certainly like 300 years from now, we're all gonna be kind of mixed and kind of like more like mocha colored. So in that case, who's going to be white anymore? And even it's funny because you think about the history. Once upon a time, the Polish people weren't considered white. Jewish people were not considered white. Italians weren't considered white. You know, Russians weren't considered white. Germans weren't considered white. The Irish aren't considered white. And so let's consider, like, who is really white in America? So who is really white in America? I think when we say white, I mean, this is why I prefer using terms like Caucasian, Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, you know, you're from the Middle East, the Near East. Like, certainly there is certain like genetic, ethnic things based on, you know, geography. So morphology-wise, morphology means, you know, like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, like morph the way we look, our facial features. Certainly the morphological features of somebody from East Asia, let's say Korea or Mongolia, is going to differ from somebody halfway across the globe in, let's say, South America or Africa, right? And I think actually when people talk about racism, we tend to really mean morphologyism, which means we discriminate other people, we elevate or discriminate people based on the morphological features of the face, like how it looks and stuff like that. Our best friend, Shepard Fairey. Yo, facts, right? Do you know that Shepard Fairey, you know, the guy who did the Hope poster? You actually know that he's from Providence, Rhode Island, and went to RISD. So shout out to RISD, but and to Senor Fairey. Okay, so even it kind of gets tricky, right? Because if you call somebody Caucasian, technically Turkish people, right? They're from the Caucasus. Caucasian means the Caucasus region, and so technically a Turkish person is white. I mean, if you went to Whole Foods, you know, you see a Turkish guy, they just look like quote unquote white people, right? But the problem is, you know, their last names are like, you know, last names that sound ethnic, you know, names we don't really recognize. Like their name's not going to be like Joe Brown or Bobby Gold or something like that. It's going to be something really long. So I actually met a dude who's Turkish American, right? Straight up looks like a white dude, you know, Caucasian dude, lighter skin, whatever. But his name is like something that sounds like Middle Eastern, right? Something Arabic or something. And so when he sends emails, people are just like kind of a little bit sus of him, right? Because Americans are kind of very suspicious and kind of like racist towards people in the Middle East or Islam, whatever. But he meets them in person, he just looks like a white dude. So the perception things are kind of funny. Now, you know, essentially my understanding of race in America is that once your family has lived here for at least like 3 generations and you've kind of become a quote unquote mutt, then you are officially quote unquote white. So for example, you know, I've talked to some kids and I'm like, oh, you know, what's your ethnicity, your heritage? He's like, I'm white. And I'm like, no, you're not white. Like, where are you from? Right? He's like, oh, you know, I'm part German, Polish, you know, Turkish, Scandinavian, whatever. And I think at least this is where I'm kind of a big fan of like these genetics testings, like the 21andMe and, you know, stuff like that. Because if everybody studies genetics, I mean the sword cuts both ways, is that people are gonna one day use it for like eugenics and whatever superiority is like, oh, you know, I'm 90% Northern European, therefore I'm superior to you or whatever. But essentially they'll find that everyone's a little bit mixed. And then you study Lucy, the cradle of humanity is Africa anyways. So so what I mean to say is no one is purely pure. We're all somehow mixed in one way or another. And then the question is just like, how far does it go back? And so this is where notions of racism and race is kind of a little bit, I think it's kind of the red herring. It's the thing that kind of distracts us. To me, actually, what's much more interesting or important is notions of class, right? Like class differences. Like essentially, it's like when you're calling somebody white versus black, you're essentially saying rich or poor is kind of my gist, right? Because, you know, race and class are kind of intermixed. We tend to think we tend to think white people are rich and in power, black people are poor and impoverished. But it's tricky because not quite true, right? Like, let's say, you know, one of my friends' name is Obi, right? His family's from Nigeria, so he's Nigerian American. You know, you look at him, you might think he's like a black guy, right? But, you know, both his parents are medical professionals. You know, whether they're middle class or upper class or rich, I'm not 100% sure. But they came to America as willingful immigrants versus other people, let's say if they're from Louisiana or the South, their descendants might have been slave owners, or they might have, their descendants might have came over in a slave ship, which is problematic because, you know, morphology wise, in terms of the way you look, you all might like kind of look more similar in terms of morphological features, but your culture, your background, your heritage, your own family's narrative is totally different. Another classic example, right? You know, so I'm Korean American, parents both from South Korea, and came to America for greater economic opportunities, right? And both my family, they're pretty rich in Korea, pretty well off. You know, my mother's side, bunch of professors, doctors, stuff like that. My dad's side, my grandfather was like an entrepreneur, you know, part in politics, government, stuff like that. And so, like me growing up, I always had a lot of pride because I knew that I came from, you know, this high class, at least in Korea, right? And even though growing up in America we're poor and we couldn't pay the rent and my mom did bankruptcy twice, it kind of wasn't that big of a deal because I knew that at least my heritage was quite high. So I never had low self-esteem in terms of that growing up. But imagine, let's say, you know, you're fleeing a war and, you know, a lot of Vietnamese people, the boat peoples, came to America as refugees fleeing a war, right? So certainly, if you come to America as a refugee, you don't really got a choice, right? It's just like reality thrusts you in that direction. Versus if you're a willingful immigrant to America and you come here via green card or work study or I don't know, whatever have you. The narrative kind of changes, right? And this is also where I find this super interesting. I mean, I don't have an answer to this, but you know, if you're Jewish or have Jewish friends or Jewish friends, ask them, are Jewish people white? And it's a tricky thing because, you know, in America, Jewish people are quote unquote white passing. Like if you went to a Whole Foods or you went to a Lululemon store, you look at the white people, they just look like typical Caucasian people, right? But depending on whether they're Ashkenazi Jews, which is like, you know, you think about B&H Photo, the people who have the traditional garbs on, versus Ashkenazi, I don't know, so is it Sephardic Jews versus Ashkenazi Jews? I kind of get them confused. One comes from Eastern Europe, which has more like Caucasian features, and the other one has more like Middle Eastern features. You know, so essentially, like, you know, people in the media like Steven Spielberg or like, you know, what's his face, Harvey Weinstein, I think is Jewish, or like Jon Stewart. I think Jon Stewart changed his name to sound more American because I think his last name sounds more Jewish. It's funny because I'm not even sure what a quote-unquote Jewish name is, but so it's kind of tricky because, you know, certainly, you know, Jewish people fled Germany and other places because of anti-Semitism. They've essentially had anti-Semitism forever. Even if you study, what's his face? The Roman Tacitus. If you read his histories, just Google Tacitus anti-Semitism towards Jewish people. He even says all these bad things about Jewish people. It's like, oh, it's a race that's like barbaric, a race born for slavery. So it's quite problematic. So Jewish people have been prosecuted forever, and they come to America and they're just trying to, you know, do the best they can. So they kind of have to hide the fact that they're Jewish. But now you look at them, typical Caucasian people, and a lot of them, you know, have have high education, are doctors, lawyers. A lot of Hollywood is controlled by, you know, people of Jewish descent. So now they've become people in positions of power and they got money. So a lot of people continue to propagate anti-Semitism, and people who are anti-Jewish tend to be lower class white people. So if you consider the fact that, you know, so once again, like, I don't have an answer for this because I'm not Jewish, right? But yo, just ask any ask, like, if you're Jewish, you have a Jewish friend, just ask them, like, and then there's no right or wrong answers. Like, are Jewish people white? You have a huge range of answers. But anyways, so to continue, so it's so interesting because this is where America doesn't really allow for dynamic definitions. I mean, like, for example, you know, Barack Obama, right? Caucasian mother, you know, kind of like African descent father, I believe. And I think Obama grew up in Indonesia, right? So very multicultural, but everyone just thought of him as black because, you know, it seems, I don't know how it works in America, but even if you're 50-50, let's say you're 50% African descent, 50% Caucasian, you suddenly become black. It's kind of strange, right? Or, you know, you think about Drake, right? I think Drake's mom is Jewish, I think. Caucasian mom, African American dad. So we look at Drake, we look at Drizzy, right? And you're like, yo, he's black. But so these definitions for race, they're not really dynamic enough. So what I encourage is, you know, I don't really think race, ethnicity, morphology, sex, gender, background, nationality matters. To me, I judge people based on their courage, their industry, their tenacity, their penchant to be genuine, to share their mind, to be courageous. And certainly these are things you could control. So like what I'm advocating for is more of this approach where you're essentially, yo, Black Rhino in the house. Shout out to John Narciso, my brother-in-law. So so kind of moving more towards this dynamic understanding where you know, morphology, we all look different, but America, we pride ourselves in diversity, melting pot, blah blah blah. I grew up in Bayside, Queens, which is next to Flushing, which is probably one of the most diverse places in America. Yeah, so like certainly we should believe more in the rainbow, right? Rainbow crew is kind of smart. I think maybe we shouldn't be talking about, you know, black versus white or colored, whatever. Yo, we should talk more about rainbow, right? So like if anyone ever called me colored, I would take that as huge. Like if anyone ever called my future kids colored, I would, like, you know, punch them in the gut, right? I'm like, you know, my kids are just my kids and my family is my family. I'm like, and everyone should be able to self-identify as different, right? Because like, who knows, maybe I want to consider myself purple. It's like, yo, Eric, what are you? I'm like, yo, I'm purple. So what are you talking about? This is like everyone trying to put you inside a box because most people, you know, have a hard time understanding nuance and dynamic properties and stuff like that. So I would just encourage, I mean, this is what I try to do personally. I'm not telling you what to do, I'm just telling you what I do. I ain't gonna call nobody black, white no more unless I'm talking in jest or just, you know, talking colloquially. However, more nuance. Nuance is a sign of wisdom, right? African American, East Asian, Afro-Caribbean American, you know, Southeast Asian, South Asian, Middle East, Near East, Levant, Caucasian, Northern European, I don't know, Southern European, Western European, Eastern European. I mean, there's so many. So the more specific we get in terms of whatever we're talking about is probably going to be more useful. And ultimately, at the end of the day, probably best not even to classify yourself. People are like, yo, Eric, what are you? I'm like, I'm Eric. Or someone's like, yo, what are you? Billy? I'm Billy. Or, you know, or Shandy, what are you, Shandy? I'm Shandy. Like, don't put yourself in a box. Maybe better for us to just say our nationality, right? Like if I met some dude on the street who's African American or East Asian or South Asian, Latino American, whatever, he's like, yo, what is you? Just be like, I'm American, right? Because I probably have more in common with a Mexican American who grew up on Dragon Ball Z than I do with even a South Korean if I go to South Korea. So anyways, let us inject more nuance into our words, kind of be careful about what we talk about. For the most part, I would encourage you to avoid politics, think more about philosophy, think long term, add more nuance, and yeah, I think the collective thriving of all of humanity, regardless of your background, seems to be the goal.